What happens when the world's greatest military power panics? In 1950, the United States was the dominant force on the globe. But behind the scenes, the military was facing a catastrophe. They called it the tank crisis. And this massive machine standing behind me, was supposed to be the solution. But look closely. This is a weapon that was hardly ever used. It was never taken to a shooting war. It was a logistical nightmare. And, unlike just about every other famous U.S. tank, the Sherman, the Patton, the Abrams, this one didn't even get a name. The M103 has to be in the running for the ultimate panic buy. And, as anyone who has ever made a rash purchase knows, such decisions are almost always followed by deep, painful buyer's remorse. This is the story of the M103 heavy tank, a monster built on fear, a victim of its own ambition, and a Cold War relic that asks the question, was bigger really better? Let's start by just looking at it. This specific vehicle is a later model, the M103A2. And, if we're being honest, it has a certain aesthetic quality to it. It looks like what you'd get if you asked a 6-year-old to draw a tank. It is exaggerated. It is bulbous. It is undeniable. There is no doubt about the fact that this is a very big, heavy tank. It tips the scales at 56.7 tons. To put that in perspective, that is a colossal amount of steel to move across a battlefield. The cast armor on the front here, the glacis plate, is 5 inches thick. It was designed to take a hit from the biggest guns the Soviets could muster. Now, let's talk about what made this thing move, because that is where the trouble begins. The original M103 and its follow-up, the M103A1, were powered by an 810 horsepower gasoline Continental A V1790 engine, paired with a General Motors automatic transmission. Now, if you know your tanks, that sounds familiar. That was the exact same powertrain found in the M48 medium tank, the vehicle this giant was supposed to fight alongside. But there was a glaring problem. The M103 was 10 tons heavier than the M48. You can imagine the result. It was underpowered. The M103 was 7 miles per hour slower than its little brother, with a top speed of just 21 miles per hour. And the range? It was pitiful. Maximum range was just 80 miles. In a European war scenario, that means you are looking for a fuel truck almost as soon as you leave the base. However, the tank we are looking at today is the A2 variant. It represents a significant attempt to fix those flaws. It has the 750 horsepower AVDS 1790 diesel engine taken from the newer M60 tank. Now, even though the horsepower is slightly lower, because it's diesel, a far more efficient fuel, and because they upped the fuel tank capacity from 280 gallons to 440, the operational range skyrocketed. It went from a meager 80 miles to a respectable 300 miles. It also squeezed out a little more speed, hitting 23 miles per hour. But you don't build a tank this big just to drive around. You build it to kill other heavy tanks. Just like earlier American tanks, there is a crew of 5 men inside this hull. But the layout is unique. In most tanks, you have a driver, a commander, a gunner, and a loader, maybe a machine gunner. In the M103, the 5th man isn't manning a machine gun. He is a second loader. Why do you need 2 men to load 1 gun? Because of this. This is the M58 120mm gun. It is powerful, and it is extremely accurate. At 1,000 yards, It can punch through 230 millimeters of armor. Even at 2,000 yards, over a mile away, it can still penetrate 210 millimeters. In the 1950s, that was a reassuring statistic. That should be enough to crack open the heaviest Soviet armor of the day. The bad news comes when you try to fire it. The ammunition is simply massive. It is two-piece ammunition, meaning the projectile, the bullet, and the propellant charge are loaded separately. And they are heavy. The projectile weighs 50 pounds. The charge weighs another 50 pounds. That is 23 kilograms of dead weight that a human being has to lift inside a cramping metal box while the vehicle is moving. So, the Army decided, one man isn't enough. You need a loader for the shell and a loader for the charge. It was a complex dance inside the turret to get this gun firing. On paper, it looks impressive, a heavy hitter. But remember, we're looking at the final, polished version here. This is a tank that suffered from a troubled development and a disappointing service history. That is what tends to happen when something is rushed into service. But it begs the question, what was the hurry? Why did the U.S. military feel the need to build this monster so quickly?
To understand the M103, we have to go back to a specific moment in history. If the Soviet Union really wanted peace, the Americans argued, it must prove it by living up to the principles of the United Nations Charter. But the geopolitical reality was far colder. In June 1950, North Korean troops mounted a surprise attack on the south. The world held its breath. Fears that this marked the beginning of wider communist moves against the West led to immediate American intervention. But here was the problem. The United States wasn't ready for war. It seems impossible today, but huge cuts in conventional forces after World War II meant the United States was in a fragile position. They had built over 88,000 tanks during the Second World War, an arsenal of democracy. But by 1945, with the war won, most of these were gone. They were scrapped as obsolete, destroyed in battle, or exported to allies. But they still had almost 30,000 on the books, right? Well, in 1945, with the coming of peace and demobilization, the U.S. Army declared all of their tanks, with the exception of the M4A3 Sherman and the new M26 Pershing, obsolete. By 1949, the active force numbered around 7,600 tanks. That was just a third of the Army's total fleet. If you think the Army was in trouble, the U.S. Marine Corps was in an even worse position. By 1949, their serviceable tank force was down to just 200 Shermans and 100 Pershings. Both branches realized they would need new tanks of all sorts, light, medium, and heavy. Why the urgency? Why the need for a heavy tank specifically? Because of one specific event, the Berlin Victory Parade of 1945. As the Western Allies watched the Soviet forces parade through the ruined streets of Berlin, they saw something that chilled them to the bone. The IS-3. The IS-3 heavy tank was unlike anything the West possessed. It had a pike nose front that deflected shells. It was low, it was wide, it carried a massive gun. The reveal of the IS-3 has a lot to answer for in Western tank development. It sparked a panic. The Allies scrambled for solutions to counter this new generation of Soviet armor. 5 years later, faced with the specter of the IS-3, a shortage of tanks in general, and now the Korean War, which had begun very badly for the US Army declared a tank crisis. They rushed their new tank project into production in what they called the Crash Program. This introduced a concept called telescoping. Now, telescoping sounds efficient, but in engineering, it is dangerous. It meant starting to build these new tanks on the assembly line, even before the designers had finished testing the prototypes. They were building them before the bugs had been ironed out. They needed new tanks fast, and they were willing to overlook the problems to get them. The race was on. The US response to the IS-3 threat came in the form of a prototype, the T-43. The T-43 was a heavy tank in every sense of the word. 60 tons combat weight, 5-inch thick frontal armor, and that massive 120mm gun. However, despite the urgency of the crash program, the T-43 was delayed. It was slowed by constant design changes, and even as these were being made, the Army Chief of Staff began questioning the need for a heavy tank entirely. The Army was getting cold feet. But the US Marine Corps, they were still very interested. At this time, Marine Corps doctrine was quite specific. They required 2 types of tank for amphibious landings. First, they needed a lighter vehicle to come ashore, with the infantry in the first wave, a role filled by the medium tank. But they also needed something bigger, something that could push inland and defeat any armored counterattacks the enemy might throw at the beachhead. This had to be a heavy tank. This doctrine wasn't just theory. It was based on blood and experience. In September 1944, at the Battle of Peleliu, Japanese Type 95 Ha-Go tanks led a counterattack against a US landing force. Now, historically, the Ha-Go was a light tank and didn't prove much of a problem for the Marines' Shermans and bazookas. But the tank battalion commander at the time noted that if the Japanese had possessed better tanks, the situation on the beach might have been critical. The Marines vowed never to be outgunned on a beachhead again. The Marines also had a political problem. They were dependent on Army programs for their equipment. They weren't a big enough player to design and order their own independent tank. So, when the Marines learned that the Army was likely to only order 80 T-43s for testing and was considering cancelling the project, they panicked. Fearing this might be their only chance to get a heavy tank, the Corps leadership quickly ordered 220 of them. The T-43 sounded promising. But remember telescoping.
The T-43 sounded promising. But remember telescoping? Even before production had finished, 114 necessary improvements had been identified. It was clear the T-43 was nowhere near ready to enter service. So, ironically, after all that rush, all 300 tanks were placed straight into storage while their fate was decided. They had rushed to build a tank that couldn't be used. The Korean War ended. The urgency evaporated. But the US military was left with 300 unusable heavy tanks. The Army decided it would only apply the 98 simplest modifications to their 80 vehicles. They renamed this modified T-43 the M103. But this still left the tank with a number of major deficiencies. The Marines, however, were not happy with good enough. They demanded more. The gunner on the original M103 was overworked to the point of failure. He had to operate the rangefinder, the gun controls, and aim the gun, all without a ballistic computer to help him with long-range firing. The Marines insisted on change. They wanted the commander to operate the rangefinder. They wanted a ballistic computer. They wanted backups. They wanted a turret basket that moved with the gun so the loaders didn't have to dance around the breech, and they wanted durable tracks. Their demands were met. Between May 1957 and July 1959, the modifications were made and the vehicle emerged as the M103A1. Let's step inside the turret of the A1 and A2 to see what they ended up with. The commander now sits at the back of the turret, high up in the bustle. He operates a rangefinder, but he can also lay and fire the main gun if needs be. The gunner is down on the right. He now has an M14 ballistic computer. This was high-tech for the time. It took in information such as range and ammunition type and automatically elevated the gun as required. But there was still a problem: physics. The recoil of the 120mm gun was so powerful that it would rock the vehicle back on its suspension violently every time it fired. This meant the gunner would lose sight of the target after every single shot. He would have to find the target again before firing the next round. Understandably, this slowed the rate of fire significantly, down to about 5 rounds a minute. And then there's the driver. He has a steering wheel, accelerator, and brake pedals, and a 4-position shifter for the automatic transmission: neutral, low range, high range, and reverse. It's actually quite intuitive, nothing a 1960s American wouldn't be familiar with from their own car. A nice touch? The maintenance. The M103 has probably the best and easiest position for air filters I've ever come across. They are right here on the fender. You open the hatch, knock the lever, pull it out, blast it with an air hose, and put it back. Ideal for desert operations. So, the tank was fixed. It was ready. But was it useful? The M103 only lasted 7 years with the Army and 15 with the Marine Corps. The Army's deployment plan was to make use of the M103's long-range hitting power. They distributed them in platoons of 3 across West Germany, deploying 1 heavy platoon per battalion of M48 medium tanks. They were the Overwatch, the big brothers designed to snipe Soviet heavies from a distance. However, the Army quickly discovered the mechanical reality. They were underpowered. The engines and transmissions might only hold together for 500 miles. The tracks wouldn't last much longer. And that 80-mile range on the gasoline versions was a logistical headache. As the new, upgraded M48s arrived with better range and reliability, the M103 became a burden. The logistics of keeping a handful of heavy tanks supplied with unique spare parts and massive 2-piece ammunition spread all over Germany was daunting. By 1963, the Army realized 2 things. First, the Soviets weren't building thousands of heavy tanks as feared. Second, there was a new U.S. tank, the M60 main battle tank. The M60 was the future. It was faster, reliable, and standardized. It could kill T-54s and T-55s. The Army happily retired the M103. The Marines, however, they are a stubborn bunch.
The Marines felt differently. They rejected the M60 initially because they didn't think it offered enough of an upgrade over their M103s. They chose to wait for a future main battle tank project. But when that project was canceled, they were stuck. To keep their fleet viable, they modernized their M103s with M60 engines, creating the M103A2. Yet, despite clinging to them, the Marines never really found a use for them. They weren't deployed to Okinawa, too heavy for the Japanese bridges and terrain. They took no part in the crisis in Lebanon. They missed the Dominican Republic intervention, and most significantly, they were never sent to Vietnam. The jungle terrain was simply unsuitable for a 60-ton beast. The M103's only operational deployment, the only time it stood ready for war, came in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. 5 M103s were assigned to the defense of the U.S. base at Guantanamo Bay. Sending such a powerful tank wasn't an overreaction. The Cubans had Soviet IS-2s, Su-100s, and T-50s. For a brief moment, the M103 stood toe-to-toe with the communist armor it was designed to fight. But the shots were never fired. Most M103s went straight from the factory to storage, only coming out for a few large-scale landing exercises. Finally,
In 1972, the Marines accepted the inevitable. If they wanted a viable tank fleet, they had to buy the M60. There was nothing else left. The M103 is a heck of a tank. It is powerful, capable, and incredibly imposing to be around. When you stand next to it, you feel the weight of the Cold War. But we have to ask the hard question. Did the Americans really need it? Was it the ultimate panic buy? Looking at it from 2025, with the benefit of hindsight, you'd probably have to say, no, they didn't. And yes, it probably was a panic buy. However, if you look at things through the eyes of Americans in the 1950s, staring down the barrel of Soviet expansion, traumatized by the surprise of Korea, and haunted by the image of the IS-3 in Berlin, you probably have to say, yes, we do need this. At the time, there was a point to building a heavy tank. Even the British reacted the same way, building the massive Conqueror tank to fight the IS-3s. The tank crisis was real to them. Rushing a new heavy tank into service, even if it is less than perfect, is an understandable reaction when you believe your existence is threatened. But that rush nearly always comes at a price. The Army's decision to telescope development included an element of panic. They called it a crisis, but they were the first to be consumed by buyer's remorse when the bill came due. The Marines, on the other hand, seemed determined to make it work. Their doctrine said they needed a heavy hitter, and they stood by their machine for 15 years. But in reality, they never found a war that fit the tank. Perhaps that ambiguity, that strange existence between necessity and uselessness, is symbolized by one simple fact. Alone amongst post-war U.S. tanks, the Sherman, the Pershing, the Patton, the Abrams, the M103 never got a name. Let's keep this in perspective, though. With just 300 built, it represents less than 1.5% of U.S. tank production between 1945 and 1960. It was a footnote. So we are left with a piece of fascinating Cold War history. A metal monument to a time when the world was terrified